Only 18% of Americans still trust the Supreme Court, and after today, you might see why. When Chief Justice John Roberts walked into that hearing, he thought it would be business as usual, until Jasmine Crockett turned his own words into a legal weapon. What started as a polite exchange exploded into a moment so raw it froze an entire room of lawmakers and left Roberts without a single answer. This isn't just politics, it's a masterclass in how one voice can shake the highest court in the land. But here's the real question: if Jasmine Crockett can make the Supreme Court blink, what else could she make happen? The cold, still air inside room 2141 felt almost ceremonial, the kind of silence you find in old courthouses where the walls have heard too many secrets to speak them aloud. Fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead, casting a pale glow on the long mahogany table. At the far end, Chief Justice John Roberts sat down with the easy confidence of a man who'd been here before. His navy suit was tailored to perfection, his silver hair immaculately parted. He reached for his cufflinks, a slow, deliberate adjustment, and gave a brief nod to the press. Click, click, click. The media's lenses snapped in unison like a pack of mechanical hounds, capturing their prey's every move. A low murmur rippled through the rows of aides and reporters. This was supposed to be another hearing in a long calendar of hearings, polite questions rehearsed, answers, a few sound bites for the evening news. Nothing that would dent the armor of America's highest court. But then the camera shifted. The marble walls faded from focus, replaced by the steady gaze of Representative Jasmine Crockett. She sat a few chairs down the committee table, her posture a masterclass in composure. Not stiff, not slouched, but centered as if every muscle knew exactly why it was there. Her pen rested quietly on a thin folder in front of her. She wasn't scribbling notes. She wasn't fidgeting. She was waiting. And in that stillness, something in the room changed. What happens when someone finally dares to ask the question power doesn't want answered? The chairman's gavel fell once crisp against the wood. This hearing will come to order. As Roberts began his opening remarks, his voice filled the space with practiced rhythm, steady, controlled, calculated. He spoke of constitutional duty, the dignity of the court, the importance of judicial independence. Words polished over decades, designed to glide over controversy without ever touching it. But Crockett didn't look at him like a colleague or an adversary. She looked at him like an investigator who already had the evidence, just waiting for the right moment to place it on the table. Halfway through his statement, a shaft of winter sunlight cut through the high window behind her. It landed directly on the folder in front of her, illuminating the top sheet, the faint outline of a highlighted name, just visible enough for the camera's zoom to catch. It wasn't his name, and that was the twist. A veteran reporter in the second row noticed it first, nudging the colleague beside him. They exchanged a glance, the kind that says something's coming. Roberts, still speaking, adjusted his cufflinks again, a small, almost imperceptible tick. From the gallery's perspective, it was just another formal proceeding. But for those who'd been around long enough, the signs were there. The locked gaze, the highlighted name, the barely concealed anticipation. Jasmine Crockett wasn't here for ceremonial oversight. She was here for a reckoning. And whether Roberts realized it or not, the clock on his comfort zone had already started ticking. The chairman's voice broke through the tension. Representative Crockett, you have the floor. She leaned forward, the sunlight now fully catching her face. Her tone was calm, but carried the weight of an approaching storm. Chief Justice, she began. You've often said the court holds itself to the highest standard of ethics, even without a formal code. Is that correct? Roberts nodded. That is correct. Congresswoman, her pen tapped once against the folder, soft but deliberate. Good, she said, a slight smile touching her lips. Because I'd like to start with a case your court never mentioned to the public, but the American people deserve to hear about. The twist was already in motion. Fade to black. Chief Justice John Roberts was no stranger to this stage. Over the years, he'd sat in rooms like this more times than most Americans could count hearings, before the Senate ceremonial addresses, carefully managed interviews. And he had a pattern. When questions grew sharp, he dulled them with legalese. When tempers rose, he lowered his voice until the air itself seemed to hush. He didn't argue. He evaded. He didn't concede. He reframed. Some called it wisdom. Others called it dodging. Either way, it had kept him at the peak of American judicial power for nearly 2 decades. Across the table sat someone who had never played that game, at least not by his rules. Representative Jasmine Crockett wasn't bred in ivy-covered halls. She cut her teeth in cramped public defender offices across Texas, defending people who couldn't dream of affording the kind of legal armor Roberts and his peers wore. She'd spent years in courtrooms where the air reeked of stale coffee and fear, watching judges lecture defendants on responsibility while the system looked the other way at its own failures. It was there she learned something Roberts never had to. You don't need to shout to be heard. You just have to aim for the soft spot no one thinks you can find. The dynamic in the room was more than institutional. It was personal. On one side, a man whose power rested on the idea that his word was beyond question. On the other, a woman whose career was built on questioning the words that had crushed lives. Outside these walls, Americans carried their own private grievances, and they weren't so different from what was about to unfold. The retired couple fighting an HOA board that fines them for a garden gnome, but lets the president's cousin keep an illegal shed. The single mom passed over for promotion because the boss's golf buddy needed it more. The small-town mayor who awards contracts to the same three friends every time. Corruption doesn't always wear a black robe, but when it does, it's harder to call out. And that was the unspoken thread tying every set of eyes to Jasmine Crockett as she adjusted her mic. She didn't lean forward aggressively. She didn't ruffle papers for effect. Her hand rested lightly on her folder, a folder that contained more than case law. It contained a strategy. Roberts knew the rhythms of verbal combat. He'd sparred with senators who built their careers on sound bites and with lawyers who wanted nothing more than to win a headline. But Crockett wasn't here for noise. Her voice when it came was steady, the kind that leaves no room for interruption because there's no wasted word to cut into. It was precision over volume, a scalpel, not a hammer, and that was her advantage. In the gallery, a reporter whispered to another, "She's setting him up." The other shook his head, eyes still locked on her. "No, she's setting the table. The meal comes next." Roberts cleared his throat, his expression a portrait of calm. But behind the stillness, he was measuring her the way you measure an opponent who's holding their cards too close to read. And Jasmine. She was already watching the clock in her mind. She knew when to drop the first fact. She knew how to make the silence work harder than the question. Some battles are won with a roar. Hers would start with a whisper. If she's not here to raise her voice, what exactly is she here to raise? The chairman's voice was barely finished granting her the floor when Jasmine Crockett's fingers lifted from her folder. She didn't glance down at her notes. Her eyes were already locked on Roberts, steady as if they'd been measuring this moment for years. "Chief Justice," she began, her tone calm enough to make the microphones lean in. "You've said the court follows a strict ethical standard even without a formal code. Is that correct?" Roberts gave a practiced nod, his hands folded neatly on the table. "That is correct, Congresswoman." The words came wrapped in confidence, but Crockett's expression didn't shift. Then she said each syllable, deliberate, helped me understand why there was no disclosure about Justice Harlan's relationship with a political donor whose case came before the court last year. The sound in the room changed, not loud but sharper, like air tightening inside a balloon. A few pens hesitated over paper. One reporter's head lifted from his laptop. Robert's posture remained upright, but his chin dipped almost imperceptibly, eyes narrowing in thought. "I'm not at liberty to comment on ongoing ethical reviews," he replied smoothly, "or on specifics related to individual justices." Crockett's pen tapped once against the folder, a subtle metronome in the silence. "I understand you can't speak to active reviews," she said, "but you can speak on precedent. Can't you?" "Yes," he answered, clipped as though speed might reclaim control. Her response came without hesitation. "Then you know the Supreme Court has historically used the appearance of impropriety as a benchmark, that it's not only about what is technically wrong, but whether the public has reason to believe something might be." Roberts shifted in his seat, the first sign of movement that wasn't rehearsed. "That standard has guided many institutions." "Yes," he admitted. She didn't pause. "So wouldn't failing to disclose a close relationship with someone who financially benefits from your court's decision look improper?" The last word landed with surgical precision. No raised voice, no accusation. Just a question that weighed heavier than a statement. Roberts inhaled through his nose, adjusted his tie, and replied, "Congresswoman, I believe we are getting into hypotheticals." The twist came without warning. Crockett leaned forward, just slightly lowering her voice so the microphones caught every word. "I'm quoting facts, Chief Justice, from your own court's disclosure records." A beat. The cameras clicked faster, trying to catch the moment. A man in the gallery whispered something to his colleague. Both stared at her, now the way you watch a chess player move a piece you didn't see coming. Robert's fingers curled over the table's edge, the subtle calm of a moment ago replaced with something else calculation. Crockett held his gaze not to challenge his authority, but to deny him the safety of ambiguity. This wasn't a debate about perception anymore. It was a test of truth. And then, without shifting her tone, she left the question hanging in the air, a hook for every mind in the room and every viewer beyond the lens. How do you hold someone accountable when they control the definition of accountability fade to silence? The question hung there like a suspended blade. How do you hold someone accountable when they control the definition of accountability? And everyone in the room knew Roberts had no safe answer. For a second, the air in room 2141 seemed heavier. Not loud, not chaotic, but weighted like gravity itself had pressed down. The Chief Justice straightened in his chair, the light from the overhead fixture catching the silver in his hair. It gave him a faint halo, but not the kind that suggested sainthood. He smoothed his tie, buying seconds that felt longer than they were. "Congresswoman," he said, his tone still even, but missing the unshakable cadence from earlier. "The judiciary is guided by long-standing principles of integrity and independence." It was the kind of sentence that could sit in a law school textbook for decades without meaning much to the people living under its shadow. Crockett didn't blink. "I've seen what principles look like when they aren't enforced," she replied, her voice steady but edged. "In my district, that means a single mother loses her housing because a landlord ignores health code violations. In other neighborhoods, it means corporations pollute drinking water because fines cost less than fixing the problem. And in this court," she tapped the papers in front of her, "it means relationships and money don't just influence perception. They tilt the scales." The camera operators caught the smallest change in Robert's body language, a subtle lean back, as if distance might soften the blow. But Crockett leaned in, closing that gap with nothing more than her words. "You've told this country the court is above politics," she continued. "But if the court can choose what to disclose and when to disclose it, that's not independence. That's insulation." A murmur from the back, maybe a staffer, maybe a reporter, rippled and died. Her examples weren't abstract. They were familiar in the way that made people at home shift uncomfortably in their recliners. Every viewer knew a version of this story: the HOA president who fines you for painting your mailbox but lets their cousin build an illegal extension. The boss who tells you, "We're all family here," right before promoting his golf buddy. The mayor who awards the same contracts to the same friends, no matter the bid. Crockett's gift wasn't just precision, it was translation. She could take the Supreme Court's marble halls and make them look exactly like the corner office that screwed you over. Roberts cleared his throat. "Congresswoman, I think we must be careful not to conflate perception with fact." She smiled, not sweetly, not sarcastically, but like someone who just found the crack in the wall. "Oh, I agree," she said. "That's why I came with both." The room shifted again, not physically, but in energy. People leaned forward, pens poised, lenses adjusted. Because in less than a minute she was going to put something on that table no one in this room, including the Chief Justice, could dodge. Jasmine Crockett didn't reach for the stack of legal briefs in front of her. Instead, she slid a single sheet from the top, its edges worn from being handled too many times. She placed it flat on the table, turning it slightly so the Chief Justice could see it. "This," she said, her voice still measured, "is Carla Jennings." Robert's eyes flicked down to the page, then back up. He didn't recognize the name, and that was the point. "She's a single mother in my district," Crockett continued. "Worked nights at a hospital for over 20 years. No strikes against her, no legal trouble. Paid her taxes, took care of her neighbors. But when her son applied for federal student aid, a clerical mistake flagged her as owing back taxes. It was wrong and she proved it, but by then the system had already closed the door. Her words didn't rise, but they carried the weight of every locked door in the lives of people watching at home. She appealed, all the way to a federal court, And she was told in so many words, tough luck. Crockett let that hang for a second long enough for viewers to remember their own moments of being dismissed. Somewhere in the gallery, a reporter lowered his pen and just listened. "But here's the part that sticks with me, Chief Justice," she said, leaning forward, "because 4 months after Carla Jennings was denied a billionaire, with private ties to a sitting justice got their case heard, argued, and ruled on in their favor in less time than it took Carla to get her first appeal processed. The twist landed quietly, but it landed. A few heads in the press row turned toward each other. Roberts shifted in his chair, clasping his hands tighter, his eyes narrowing as if trying to decide whether to challenge her example or move past it. "This isn't about left or right," Crockett pressed. "It's about the appearance and the reality that access to justice in this country isn't measured in the merits of your case, but in the weight of your connections." Roberts cleared his throat, a small tell in a man usually so controlled. "Congresswoman, the court must operate within its limited capacity. Capacity," Crockett cut in, not rudely, but decisively, "isn't the issue. Priorities are. And when billionaires get the front door and people like Carla Jennings get the locked one, we need to ask, who is this court really serving?" Her gaze stayed fixed on him, unblinking, a portrait of quiet resolve. The overhead lights cast a sharp line across the table between them, bright on her side, shadowed on his. It was the perfect visual metaphor, and the cameras caught it. In the next breath, she was about to name a case and a justice that would put Roberts exactly where he didn't want to be on record. Jasmine Crockett didn't pause for effect. She didn't need to. The weight of what she was about to say already lived in the room. "Chief Justice," she said, sliding another page into view, "are you familiar with Dalton v. Mason County, decided by the Fifth Circuit in 2009? Roberts' eyes sharpened. "Vaguely. A procedural ruling involving judicial recusal, if I recall correctly." "You don't," she replied, not mocking, just matter of fact. "It involved a judge who failed to recuse himself from a case where he had indirect financial ties to one of the law firms involved. The ruling was clear. Even the appearance of conflict was grounds for removal." She tapped the document. "It became precedent. Your court has cited it before." The room shifted again, not loudly but visibly. One of the younger aides at the far end of the committee table leaned forward, eyebrows raised. Someone in the press gallery whispered, "Here it comes." Crockett flipped the page. "And yet," she continued, "just last year, Justice Harlan participated in Macon versus Delta Rail, a case where his longtime friend and financial backer stood to gain millions, depending on the outcome. No recusal, no disclosure, no explanation. And the ruling came down 5-4. She didn't blink. Guess which side he was on?" Roberts didn't answer. His fingers had returned to the table's edge, no longer gently resting, but gripping. The tie he'd adjusted so confidently before was now a little tighter at the collar. Crockett let the silence do its work. Then, in a softer tone, the kind that hits harder because it pretends not to, she asked, "You said earlier that each justice is responsible for their own disclosures, that there's a process." Her head tilted slightly. "Is that process one the American people can trust when a justice fails to report a financial tie that directly impacts a decision?" Roberts tried to redirect. "Congresswoman, I'm not here to litigate individual cases. I'm not asking you to litigate," she said, cutting in again. Calm as ever. "I'm asking you if the people of this country should be satisfied with a system that lets a man sit in judgment over a case where his friend stands to profit without ever having to explain why." The quiet was louder now than any shout could have been. In living rooms across the country, viewers felt it. They might not know the specifics of Macon versus Delta Rail, but they knew the feeling when the rules don't apply the same way to everyone. Roberts shifted again. "The court takes these concerns seriously but has no formal code of conduct." Crockett finished. "No external review, no required transparency. Just a system where the judges judge themselves." The twist came in her final line, not angry, not bitter. Just truth sharpened into a point. "Where I come from, we don't call that justice. We call that unchecked power. And if unchecked power lives in the highest court in the land, who's really safe from its silence?" For a moment, it seemed the entire room was holding its breath. Roberts sat motionless, his hands still clasped at the table's edge, the faint shadow of tension now visible across his jawline. The mahogany surface between him and Crockett reflected a thin strip of light from the overhead fixtures, a dividing line neither could cross physically, but one she was about to cross in every other way. She leaned back slightly, her voice calm, but edged with unmistakable purpose. Chief Justice, you just heard me outline Macon Veer's Delta Rail and Justice Harlan's undisclosed ties. You've said the court takes concerns seriously. I want to go back to something the court itself has long embraced: the appearance standard. Not just whether something is wrong, but whether it looks wrong to the public. Roberts shifted this time, leaning forward, clasping his hands as if to anchor himself. Congresswoman perception can be misleading. She didn't let the air cool, and it can also be accurate. The appearance standard exists because trust in justice is as fragile as glass. You don't wait for it to shatter before you protect it. Her tone wasn't loud, but the emphasis on fragile made the gallery lean in. She reached into her folder again, sliding out a smaller single-page excerpt highlighted in yellow. Here's your court citing that very standard. Your words, Chief Justice, in a 2013 public address at Harvard Law. You told graduates, and I quote, "Your credibility is your currency. The moment people stop believing in your integrity, everything else collapses." The twist hit hard because she wasn't using an opponent's words, she was using his. The look in Roberts' eyes flickered just briefly, the tiniest acknowledgement that he recognized the trap: argue against her now, and he would be arguing against himself. This isn't about one justice, one case, or one headline, Crockett continued. It's about a pattern. Americans are looking at your court, at their court, and they're seeing decisions that benefit friends, donors, and political allies. They're seeing billionaires fly justices to private resorts while cases involving those same billionaires are decided behind closed doors. And when they ask questions, they're told it's all fine because the court says it is. The camera cut to Robert's profile, the faintest tightening around his mouth. His hands flexed once against each other before stilling again. Crockett's voice softened, which only made it more dangerous. When I was a public defender, I watched judges lecture young men, black, white, Latino, about how even the appearance of dishonesty could destroy their future. But here in the highest court in the land, that same standard is treated like a suggestion. What message do you think that sends to every courtroom in America? For the first time, Roberts didn't immediately respond. The silence wasn't just between them. It filled the corners of the room, seeping into the spaces between camera clicks and the scratch of pens. Outside Americans watching on their living room TVs could feel it too, like the pause before a verdict is read. Finally, he spoke slower now. Congresswoman, the judiciary operates on trust that she cut in, not to overpower him, but to redirect the weight of his own sentence. Must be earned. And right now, Chief Justice, the American people are wondering if that trust is still deserved. Her gaze stayed locked, unflinching. The light above caught the curve of her cheekbone, making her eyes sharper, in contrast to the soft shadow falling over Roberts' face. If the court's credibility is its currency, what happens when the bank is empty and the people are the ones left holding the debt? The pause after her last question lingered heavy enough to feel like a verdict in itself. Roberts' gaze dipped to the papers in front of him as though they might offer an escape route. They didn't. When he looked back up, the cameras caught a subtle change in his expression, still composed but with the faint tension of a man calculating his next move instead of dictating it. Crockett slid another document onto the table. This one wasn't a case file or a speech transcript. It was a printed graph, bold lines in black and red, the kind of visual you could read from the back row. Chief Justice, she began, her voice, even this is Gallup's latest polling data on trust in the Supreme Court. 20 years ago, that number was 62%. Today, 18. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The drop spoke louder than any headline could. A ripple went through the room. One reporter mouthed 18 to his colleague, who gave a slow, confirming nod. This isn't partisan noise, Crockett continued. It's not a headline from one side of the aisle. It's a statistical freefall, and it started long before any one case or one justice. The American people aren't just losing faith in decisions they disagree with. They're losing faith in the institution itself. Roberts leaned forward slightly, hands clasped again, his tone deliberately calm. Congresswoman, public opinion can be shaped by misunderstanding, and by experience, she cut in, still steady. When a small business owner in Ohio loses a case because she can't afford a team of high-priced attorneys, She doesn't need to read a poll to know what fairness feels like. When a veteran in Arizona watches his benefits denied without explanation, he doesn't need to see a statistic to understand the word unaccountable. She paused, letting the example settle not just in the room, but in living rooms across the country. Roberts exhaled through his nose a controlled breath, but one that said he knew she wasn't talking theory anymore. This was the part of the hearing he couldn't retreat from with technicalities. Crockett leaned in just enough to close the psychological space between them. 18% Chief Justice. That's not a number that's an alarm, and it's getting louder every year. If this court's credibility is its currency, you're not just running low, you're overdrawn. The twist came as she slid the graph closer, so the bright red line of decline sat directly in front of him. And here's the thing she added. Once people believe the system is rigged against them, they stop showing up for it. That's not just dangerous for the court, that's dangerous for democracy. For a second, Roberts' eyes stayed on the paper instead of her. It wasn't defeat, but it was the first time he seemed more interested in what was on the table than what was being said. If trust in the highest court collapses, what's left to hold the rest of the system together? And who will step in when the cracks turn into a break? For a few long seconds, no one said anything. The only sound was the faint hum of the ceiling lights above room 2141. Roberts kept his eyes on the chart in front of him, that damning red line plunging downward like a slow-motion collapse. It wasn't just data, it was diagnosis. Then Jasmine Crockett spoke again, quieter now, and somehow that made her words land harder. I came here today with respect, Chief Justice. I came here with facts. But the facts say your institution has a problem, a deep one. She leaned back slightly, eyes never leaving his. And it's time someone stopped pretending otherwise. Across the room, the energy shifted. One of the younger representatives who had been tapping his pen stopped mid-motion. A reporter at the back lowered her phone mid-type. Even the chairman, who'd maintained a neutral posture for most of the hearing, folded his hands in front of his mouth, watching more closely now. You told Harvard law graduates that credibility is currency, Crockett continued. That once people stop believing in your integrity, everything else collapses. Roberts' hands still clasped, gave the faintest twitch a squeeze maybe, or maybe just restraint. Her voice dropped half a register. Then tell me, Chief Justice, how does credibility survive when the court looks more like a gated estate than a public institution? She let it linger, didn't rush, didn't blink. The public doesn't get private flights to Montana. They don't get expedited hearings because they golf with a justice's brother-in-law. They don't get decisions in 4 months while others wait 4 years. They get told to trust the process, even when the process is guarded like a fortress. Roberts adjusted his tie again, slower this time. He opened his mouth, but she kept going. Not over him, through him. I've watched young men lose their futures for far less than what your colleagues have quietly signed off on. And no robe, no tradition, no marble column should protect anyone from accountability. And then came the sentence, the one that would be clipped, tweeted, quoted on cable news and over Sunday dinners in Alabama, Detroit, Tallahassee, and Fresno. Credibility is currency. And right now, your institution is in overdraft. There was no gasp, no dramatic music, but something happened in the silence that followed a collective recognition, even among those who disagreed with her politics, that the line had cut bone deep. Even Roberts didn't flinch. He just looked at her for the first time, not with the restraint of power, but the stillness of someone who'd been hit squarely with truth. If the court is in overdraft, who's been paying the price all these years? And what happens when the people finally demand a refund with interest? The echo of Jasmine Crockett's last words. Your institution is in overdraft still lingered in the air when she leaned back, allowing the weight of the moment to settle. Robert's expression was controlled, but the camera's close-up caught a subtle shift. The faint tightening around his eyes, the jawline held just a fraction too still. The overhead lights poured a pale gold onto the table, dividing it like a stage Crockett in light Roberts in the cooler shadow. It was as if the very room had chosen sides. Let's talk about what that overdraft means. Crockett said, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of something heavier, the kind of heaviness that comes from lived experience, not talking points. She reached into her folder again this time, pulling out a single photograph. She didn't slide it toward him immediately. She held it in her hands, glancing at it before letting the cameras catch the image. A man in a faded baseball cap, the brim frayed, smiling just enough to soften the tired lines on his face. "This is Jorge Salgado," she said. "Truck driver. Worked through the pandemic. No complaints, no skipped shifts. He kept this country moving while the rest of us stayed home." Her voice dipped softer now, not for weakness, but for weight. When his brother was detained in a private immigration facility and denied medical care, Jorge did what the law tells every American to do. He filed a petition. He followed the process. And do you know what happened? Roberts kept his eyes on her, but his fingers moved. Clasp, unclasp, clasp again. The court denied it, without hearing the facts, without so much as an explanation. She finally slid the photo forward, letting it rest between them. 4 months later, a corporation with ties to 2 justices got its case heard, argued, and ruled on. The difference: Jorge doesn't own a golf resort. He just drives the goods that stock their shelves. The twist came when she didn't stop there. And here's the part no one wants to say out loud. Jorge's case didn't just disappear. It was marked as low priority in an internal docket review. I have the memo, and I'm going to enter it into the record today. She placed another paper beside the photo, the words "low priority" highlighted in stark yellow. A murmur broke in the gallery, not loud but sharp, like the air itself had just been cut. Robert's gaze flickered toward the paper, then back to her. "This isn't about abstract legal theory," she said, her voice regaining its firmness. "It's about how this court chooses who matters. Jorge's brother didn't matter enough. Carla Jennings didn't matter enough." She let the silence stretch again. The cameras stayed on her, the faint shine of light across her cheekbone, the resolute stillness in her posture. Every detail, every controlled pause. Just as she said, finally, isn't just the absence of corruption. It's the presence of fairness. And right now, the presence is missing. Her words hung in the room, drawing the audience both in person and at home into a personal reckoning. The twist was that she wasn't asking Roberts to answer her anymore. She was asking the country. If fairness is missing from the highest court in the land, what chance does it have in the smallest court in your hometown? And how many Jorges are out there waiting for an answer they'll never get? Jasmine Crockett didn't take her eyes off Roberts, but her words were no longer just for him. The slight pivot in her chair, the way her body angled toward the audience behind her, told the cameras everything they needed to know. She was speaking to America now. The studio lights above the committee table gave her skin a warm glow, while Roberts remained in a cooler wash, like a man sitting just outside the firelight. "When we talk about the court," she began, "we talk about it like it's some far-off marble fortress. But the truth is, its decisions reach into every living room, every kitchen table, every hospital waiting room in this country." Her voice slowed each sentence, placed like a stone in a path she was building for her viewers to walk down. "You might think this hearing is about procedure, about rules, about ethics codes. It's not. It's about the lives on the other side of those decisions." She let her gaze sweep the gallery, catching the eyes of people who weren't used to being part of the official record: an elderly man in a faded VFW cap, a young mother rocking a sleeping baby. When your water bill triples because a utility company wins a case at the Supreme Court, that's this court. When your grandchild's school loses funding because of a ruling in Washington, that's this court. And when someone you love gets sick and can't afford care because of a decision handed down here, that's this court too. The twist came without warning. She picked up Jorge Salgado's photo again and held it in front of her for the cameras, not for Roberts. Most people will never meet a Supreme Court justice, but they'll meet the consequences of your decisions. And unlike you, those consequences don't shake hands. They don't smile for the cameras. They just show up at the door and change everything. Roberts adjusted his tie, a familiar tick by now, but this time he glanced at the cameras just for a second, and the feed caught it. A rare moment where he seemed aware that the spotlight had shifted off the institution and onto the people it was supposed to serve. Crockett leaned in again, bringing the moment back to him. "You told this country the court operates independently, that it's immune from politics. But independence without accountability isn't strength, Chief Justice. It's isolation, and isolation is where empathy goes to die." Her words didn't rise. They pressed down, each one heavier than the last. The room was still except for the soft click of a camera lens zooming tighter on her face. I became a lawyer because I believed in the law's promise, she said. Not its perfection, its promise. The promise that no matter who you were, you'd get a fair hearing. That you wouldn't be invisible. She looked directly into the main camera now, not Roberts. But the truth is, millions of Americans feel invisible to this court. And if you're watching this at home thinking, that's not me, ask yourself this: if the system can ignore Jorge Carla and countless others, how long before it ignores you? If the people the court serves become invisible, what's to stop justice itself from disappearing? And when that day comes, who will have the courage and the voice to bring it back into view? The air in room 2141 felt different now, heavier, as if the weight of the stories Jasmine Crockett had told lingered in the oxygen itself. Robert sat in his chair, shoulders squared but noticeably still, like a chess player realizing the next move might cost more than he can afford. The warm wash of light from above still caught Crockett's side of the table, casting her in a quiet, deliberate glow. His side remained cooler, more muted, a visual split the cameras loved. Chief Justice, she began again, her voice measured, but with an unmistakable edge of momentum. You've described the court as independent. That word carries weight. It's meant to inspire confidence. But when independence means you answer only to yourself, it stops being a safeguard. It becomes a shield. She let that settle for a moment, her gaze unwavering. And shields can protect, or they can hide. Roberts interlocked his fingers, leaning forward as if to steady himself. Congresswoman, judicial independence is the cornerstone of our democracy. She cut in not loudly but with surgical precision. And every cornerstone still has to pass inspection. Independence without oversight is how you get a fox guarding the henhouse. The metaphor landed hard. A ripple of shifting bodies in the gallery followed the sound of a pen snapping its clip back and forth somewhere in the press row. Her right hand slid another paper onto the table, this one marked not with a case citation, but with an internal judiciary memo obtained through a whistleblower. This document, she said, tapping the top corner, details how ethical complaints against sitting justices are handled internally. It reads, and I quote, "All reviews are conducted at the discretion of the justice named in the complaint." A murmur stirred in the back. Robert's jaw tightened. That means, Crockett continued, if a justice is accused of wrongdoing, that justice decides whether or not to investigate themselves. Tell me, Chief Justice, what would you call that anywhere else? Because where I come from, that's not accountability, that's immunity. The twist came when she leaned back, folding her hands in a mirror of his posture, as if to remind the room that this wasn't just his seat of power, it was hers too, at least for this moment. You've told me and the American people that the judiciary must remain free from political pressure, but political pressure isn't what I'm offering. I'm offering daylight. And daylight doesn't care who it makes uncomfortable. Robert shifted slightly one shoulder, lifting and settling again. He glanced toward the committee chair, perhaps looking for a cue to redirect, but the chair's eyes stayed fixed on Crockett. She had the floor, and everyone knew it. Independence is valuable, she said, lowering her tone so the microphones caught every syllable. But when independence turns into isolation, empathy dies, trust erodes, and justice stops being about the people it serves. And if you can't see that from where you're sitting, maybe it's time to get up and stand where they are. Her words were a bridge not just to the next question, but to the audience at home. The camera cut to a close-up of her face, steady and unblinking, then to Roberts, who now looked less like an untouchable figure and more like a man in a tightening corner. If the highest court in the land can choose when and whether to hold itself accountable, what hope does any citizen have when they face a judge alone? And if no one dares to break that shield, how much longer before it becomes a wall we can't see through it all? The phrase "fox guarding the henhouse" still hung in the air, raw and unvarnished, when Jasmine Crockett leaned forward again. Her hands rested lightly on the folder in front of her, not gripping, not fidgeting, just anchored the way a pilot steadies a plane before descent. Robert sat motionless, the cool glow on his side of the table, contrasting with the warm spotlight that bathed hers. The divide was almost poetic. "Chief Justice." She began, her tone calm enough to sound conversational, but with the unmistakable cadence of someone building towards something sharp. "You've told this country the court is impartial, that justice is blind. But I've spent the last 2 years connecting threads the public was never meant to see, and the pattern is undeniable. She reached into her folder, pulled out a chart, and laid it flat on the table so the camera could see. Lines of red string, black arrows, and names covered the page like the blueprint of a heist. This, she said, tapping the center, is a map of every case in the last decade involving a party with direct personal or financial ties to a sitting justice. Out of 47 cases, 41 were decided in favor of that party. The twist hit in the silence that followed. Someone in the press gallery let out a low, involuntary whistle before catching themselves. Robert's eyes narrowed just slightly, the look of a man who knew the numbers, but not that they would be presented this way in front of this audience. Crockett leaned in, voice still steady. This isn't coincidence. It's consistency. Consistency in the wrong direction. And when patterns like this exist, you can't call it impartiality, you call it favoritism. She glanced at the gallery, then back to Roberts. The public calls it corruption. Roberts shifted his weight, his shoulders drawing back as if to reassert authority. Congresswoman, these cases are complex, they are. She agreed. And so is the fact that billionaires who share vacation homes with justices have their cases decided faster than veterans fighting for medical benefits. So is the fact that corporations with board members who've clerked for this court win appeals at twice the rate of everyone else. These are complex patterns, Chief Justice, but the conclusion is simple. The people with access get outcomes. The people without access get excuses. She let that last line breathe, then slid a second sheet across a list of case names with the justice's personal connections annotated in red ink. The camera caught Robert's hand, twitch as though he might instinctively reach for it before he stopped himself. This is why trust is collapsing, Crockett said, her voice dropping half a register. Not because people don't understand the law, but because they understand all too well how it's applied. They see the front door swing open for some and slam shut for others. And they know deep down that the robe doesn't make the judge immune from bias. It just hides it better. Her posture didn't waver, but her words pressed forward like a slow, unrelenting tide. We can talk about independence all day, Chief Justice, but independence without integrity isn't a virtue. It's a vulnerability, and the people are paying for it every single day. If the highest court's decisions can be traced back to friendships, favors, and financial ties, what's really being judged, the case or the person who brought it? And if patterns don't lie, how much longer before the people stop listening to the verdicts entirely? Roberts adjusted his papers, the faint shuffle amplified by the silence that had fallen over room 2141. He inhaled to begin what was clearly a prepared line, the kind of polished statement designed to reframe the hearing and steer it back onto safe ground. Congresswoman, while I appreciate your concerns, it is important to remember, Chief Justice Crockett said, cutting in smoothly, her voice calm but unyielding, I'm not here for reminders. I'm here for answers. The interruption landed like a gavel. Not rude, not reckless, precise. It broke his rhythm before it even had a chance to build. He blinked once, a fraction slower than normal, and for a man trained in public composure, that blink was the equivalent of a stumble. Crockett leaned forward slightly enough that the overhead light caught the edge of her cheekbone, sharpening the focus on her eyes. You've given this committee the same lines you've given in every appearance about tradition, about the separation of powers, about judicial independence. But independence doesn't mean insulation, and separation doesn't mean secrecy. She slid another document across the table, a case docket with dates highlighted in 2 different colors. On March 14th of last year, a small business owner from Ohio filed an appeal that took 14 months to be denied. 14 months. On April 2nd of that same year, a Fortune 500 company with a board member who shares property with a sitting justice filed a petition. It was heard and ruled on in just under 4 months. Same court, same process. The only difference was who they knew. Robert's lips pressed together, not in defiance, but in recalibration. He glanced down at the document, and for a split second, the camera caught something rare. His eyes moving faster than his expression, scanning for a foothold that wasn't there. This isn't about you personally, Crockett said, her tone steady but firm. It's about the institution you lead. You keep telling the American people to trust the court, but trust isn't something you demand. It's something you earn. And right now you're asking the country to accept verdicts they no longer believe are blind. The twist came in how she delivered the next line, not to him, but to the audience watching from their living rooms. She turned slightly toward the camera, her voice lowering. Think about the last time you stood in line for something important, a medical test, a loan application, a job interview, and someone else walked right past you straight to the front. Now imagine that someone has been doing it for decades, and the line they're cutting is the justice system itself. A ripple went through the gallery, not loud, but a shift, as if people were leaning forward without meaning to. Roberts adjusted his tie again, but this time the gesture looked more like a stall than a habit. Crockett leaned back in her chair, not as retreat, but as control. You can call that perception, Chief Justice. I call it a pattern. And patterns, when ignored, become culture. And culture, when unchecked, becomes corruption. If corruption can hide behind the very institution built to fight it, how do you pull it into the light without breaking the foundation itself? And who has the courage to try? The clock on the back wall ticked audibly now, each second stretching longer than it should. Jasmine Crockett sat back for a beat, her hands resting loosely in her lap, a posture of composure. But inside she could feel the burn of a truth that had been building for years. She remembered all the times she'd stood in smaller courtrooms, fighting for people who didn't have a microphone or a title or a room full of cameras. She knew the hollow look of a client who had just been told that's the law, when what it really meant was that's the way it's always been. The difference now was that she wasn't powerless, and she wasn't alone. Millions were watching, and she could almost hear the quiet hope in their living rooms, the hope that someone finally might say the thing they'd been thinking all along. She leaned forward again, and the light caught her eyes in a way that made the cameras zoom tighter. Chief Justice, she said, voice lower now, but steady as bedrock. In this hearing, you've spoken of principles, tradition, and trust. But I want to talk about silence, because silence is also a choice, and too often it's the choice that serves power the best. Roberts didn't move, but the faintest crease formed between his brows. She let that reaction sit for half a second before continuing. When this court fails to explain why certain cases are heard and others aren't, that's silence. When justices don't recuse themselves, despite conflicts of interest, that's silence. And when the people ask why billionaires get decisions in months while ordinary citizens wait years, and you offer no answer, that's silence too. The twist came when she shifted from him to them, the invisible them, who'd been shut out of the system for generations. I've been on the other side of that silence. I've had clients, mothers, veterans, students who walked into court knowing the decision had already been made. I've seen what it does to someone's spirit when they realize justice isn't about the truth, it's about who has the leverage. And I can tell you, Chief Justice, that feeling stays with you long after you leave the courthouse. Roberts inhaled slightly as if preparing to respond, but she didn't yield the space. She leaned in, her voice just above a whisper, now the kind of tone that forces people to lean closer to hear. The most dangerous thing about silence is that it pretends to be neutral, but it's never neutral. It always helps one side. He exhaled slow and controlled, but no words followed. The cameras caught it, the rare moment when the Chief Justice of the United States had nothing to say. Crockett didn't smirk, didn't gloat. She let the silence expand until it filled the room. And in that space, her restraint became the point. For years, Roberts had been the one to control the tempo of these hearings. Now she held the clock. Finally, she sat back, her gaze unwavering. If the court's credibility is already in overdraft, Chief Justice, every day you stay silent, the interest compounds. She let the weight of it hang there. And for the viewers at home, those who had ever been dismissed, doubted, or forced to swallow injustice, it wasn't just her question to him. It was their question to the system. If silence from the powerful has already shaped the rules we live under, what will it take and who will it take to break it before it becomes permanent? The silence between them stretched like a taut wire. For the first time that morning, Robert's hands weren't perfectly still. His right thumb rubbed absently at the edge of his wedding band, not fidgeting exactly, but a tell for anyone watching closely. The cameras caught it, and so did Jasmine Crockett. Inside, she felt the tremor of a win. Not the kind you celebrate, but the quiet knowledge that a wall had shifted. Years in courtrooms had taught her that you don't need to see the bricks fall, you just need to hear the strain in the mortar. She kept her expression neutral, refusing to betray even a flicker of satisfaction. This wasn't about her. It was about making sure the crack in that wall widened far enough for the people on the other side to be heard. Roberts cleared his throat, leaning forward slightly. His voice was measured but less certain now, as if each word was being weighed against the risk of giving away too much. "Congresswoman, I understand your concerns." A small murmur in the gallery followed. It wasn't an admission of guilt, but it was a shift in posture. The Chief Justice of the United States was no longer deflecting. He was acknowledging. Crockett didn't rush in to fill the space. She knew the value of letting him speak into the quiet she'd created. He continued, "The court is aware that public trust is essential to our function, and we have taken steps to address some of the issues you've raised." The twist came when she tilted her head, just slightly, a hint of curiosity playing at the edge of her lips. "Steps," she echoed, "or gestures?" The distinction landed heavier than a direct accusation. Robert's gaze flicked down to the papers on the table, then back up. Her voice lowered, deliberate, intimate, like she was inviting every viewer at home into the conversation. "I know what it feels like to be told someone's taking steps to fix a problem, only to realize those steps lead in a circle. My clients have heard it from landlords, from employers, from local officials. We're working on it, but the mold is still on the ceiling. The paycheck is still short. The court date never comes." The older audience watching from their living rooms knew that feeling of being placated instead of helped. The cameras panned briefly to the gallery. An elderly veteran in the second row nodded faintly, as if she'd said aloud what he'd carried for years. Roberts adjusted his posture, but there was no trace of the confident smirk he'd worn at the start of the hearing. "We can do better," he said simply. The words hung there understated, but for anyone paying attention, they were remarkable in their own right. Crockett leaned forward, her tone sharpening just enough to signal that she wasn't here for platitudes. "Then let's talk about how, because trust doesn't return on promises. It returns on proof." Her gaze was unwavering, but inside she felt the heat of the moment, the rare awareness that a man who'd spent decades behind the fortress of judicial immunity had just cracked the door open, even if only an inch. If even the most insulated figure in American justice can be made to admit the need for change, what's stopping the rest of the system from following? And what will it take to make sure they do? The committee chair's gavel struck once, announcing a brief recess. Chairs scraped back, aides shuffled papers, and the low hum of side conversations replaced the tense silence that had dominated moments before. Jasmine Crockett gathered her notes slowly, careful not to let her hands betray the adrenaline still coursing through her. She'd held her ground against the most powerful judge in the country, but the moment wasn't over. She knew some victories happen in the exchange, others in what follows. As she stepped away from the table, a movement in the corner caught her eye. A group of visitors, likely part of a civic program, had been watching from the back. Among them, a teenage girl in a navy sweater clutched a spiral notebook to her chest. The girl's hair was pulled back tight, her eyes wide with the kind of focus only young conviction can carry. Crockett recognized the look immediately. She'd worn it herself years ago, sitting in the gallery of a courtroom for the first time, wondering how the people at the front got there and whether someone like her ever could. The girl hesitated, then stepped forward as an aide held the door open for the committee members. "Congresswoman Crockett," she asked, voice small but steady. Can I ask you something?" Jasmine paused, leaning slightly so they were at eye level. "Of course." The girl's question was disarmingly simple. "Are they above you?" Her gaze flicked toward Roberts, who was speaking quietly with another justice, before leaving the room. Crockett's first instinct was to smile, to brush it off with a quick answer. But she felt the weight in the question, the weight of every young person who'd been told implicitly or explicitly that certain people live on a different plane, immune to the rules everyone else must follow. She thought of her clients who'd been crushed under systems that refused to see them. She thought of her own first years in law when she'd been treated as though her place was temporary, conditional. She straightened, letting the moment have its space. "No," she said, her voice warm but resolute. "They're not." She held the girl's gaze a second longer. "And the day we start believing they are is the day we lose the right to hold them accountable." The girl nodded slowly, as if filing it away for a time she'd need it. The twist came when one of the reporters nearby, who had been pretending to check his phone, scribbled the exchange into his notepad. Crockett didn't need to look to know it would end up in a headline by nightfall, reframed as the emotional heartbeat of the hearing. As she walked back toward the committee room, she felt the same burn in her chest she'd had earlier. But this time, it wasn't the fire of confrontation. It was something quieter, steadier, the knowledge that the fight wasn't just for the people who'd lost faith, but for the ones still deciding whether to believe in the system at all. If we teach the next generation that some people are untouchable, how long before they stop reaching for justice altogether? And if we can teach them instead that no one is above accountability, what could they build in our place? When Jasmine Crockett stepped back into room 2141, the air felt altered. The chatter that had filled the recess was quieter now, the kind of hush that comes when everyone knows the hardest part is behind them, but the most revealing part is still to come. The overhead lights seemed warmer than before, the golden reflection on the mahogany table stretching further toward her side, as if the room itself was leaning in. Roberts was already seated, his papers neatly stacked, his expression composed, but no longer unreadable. He looked up as she took her chair, and there was something in his eyes, not concession, but recognition. The kind of look people give when they finally understand you're not just passing through their world, you're standing in it. The chair cleared his throat. "We'll resume." His voice was steady, but even he glanced between the two of them, like a man aware he was watching history, or at least something that would be remembered. Crockett didn't waste time. "Chief Justice, before the break, you acknowledged the importance of public trust and that the court could do better. I'd like to know specifically what changes you're willing to commit to that could be implemented before the next term." Robert's gaze flicked to the chairman, then back to her. His hands clasped neatly on the table didn't move. "Congresswoman, certain reforms are already being discussed internally. I am prepared to consider a more formal code of conduct, as has been suggested by members of this body." The twist came not in his words, but in how they landed. For years, such a statement would have been a non-committal deflection, another piece of political theater. But now in this context, it felt like the first brick loosened in a long sealed wall. The reporters in the back row shifted pens, scratching faster. Crockett tilted her head, her expression neither triumphant nor dismissive. "Prepared to consider is not prepared to act," she said evenly. "The people who sent me here and the millions watching this exchange don't measure change in committees. They measure it in whether the rules finally apply to everyone in equal measure." A flash of something frustration maybe passed over Roberts' face before settling back into neutrality. "I understand that perspective," he said. She leaned in slightly, her voice softening without losing its edge. "Do you? Because understanding it means recognizing that every day without change is another day the public believes the court protects itself first and justice second. You can issue rulings, Chief Justice, but rulings don't build trust. Actions do." The moment held. The gallery was silent. Even the hum of the lights felt subdued, as if the building itself was listening. Inside, Crockett could feel the weight of what wasn't being said. The years of decisions that had eroded public faith, the people who had walked into courtrooms already knowing the verdict, the voices that had been silenced by process and procedure. She carried all of it in that pause, letting it sit heavy enough for the audience at home to feel too. If a promise for reform begins with "prepared to consider," how do we make sure it ends with "we have changed"? And when power hesitates, who will stand in the gap long enough to push it forward? The committee room was empty now. The cameras were gone, the reporters filing their stories somewhere down the hall. The echo of voices had faded, leaving only the faint hum of the building's air system and the muted thud of footsteps far in the distance. Jasmine Crockett sat alone at the long mahogany table, the same one that had been a battlefield only an hour earlier. The warm glow from the overhead lights was softer now, casting long shadows across the stacks of documents in front of her. She didn't move right away. Her hands rested on either side of her folder, fingers splayed as if holding the day in place. Inside there was a current of exhaustion running beneath the adrenaline, the kind you feel after carrying weight that isn't just yours. She thought about Carla Jennings, about Jorge Salgado, about every client she'd once stood beside in court who'd walked out with a verdict they never had a real chance to change. Her mind flashed to moments that didn't make it into the record, the way Robert's voice faltered when she pressed on the appearance standard, the look in his eyes when he realized she wasn't going to be steered away from specifics. The silence that had turned from his weapon into hers. The public would see the clips, the headlines, the quotes. But she'd felt the shift. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was movement. She reached into her folder and pulled out a stack of letters bound by a rubber band. Constituents. Strangers. People she'd never meet who had still decided to send their stories, their frustrations, their hope. One was from a retired steelworker in Pennsylvania who'd lost his pension after a company merger approved under a ruling the court refused to hear. Another from a widow in Arizona whose medical debt had doubled after a legal loophole the court left intact. Each page was a reminder today hadn't been about winning an argument. It had been about putting those voices into a room where they were never meant to be. The twist came when her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Just 2 words, thank you. No name, no context, but she knew exactly what it meant. Somewhere someone watching had felt less invisible. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. Beneath her composure, there was still the ache of the fight, the ache of being doubted, underestimated, and told to wait your turn so many times that standing your ground felt like breaking a law of nature. And she knew in that moment that this was why she couldn't afford to lose momentum. Her eyes moved to the empty chair where Roberts had sat, perfectly aligned with the center microphone. It was just a chair now, wood, leather, and steel. The power it represented was in the man who'd occupied it. And that power had finally been forced to listen. If the walls of power can hear the truth once, what's to stop them from hearing it again? And what happens if enough voices refuse to stop speaking? The hallway outside room 2141 was a blur of movement, reporters packing up tripods, staffers juggling phones and folders, security checking the exits. Jasmine Crockett stood just inside the doorway, watching it all with the stillness of someone measuring her next step. The hearing was technically over, but she knew the real closing was still hers to deliver. An aide approached quietly. "They're still live on C-SPAN if you want to make a closing remark," he said, almost as if he was testing whether she had anything left to give. She gave a small nod and walked back to the microphone. The room was mostly cleared now, but a handful of journalists had stayed, sensing that this was one of those moments that could become more than a footnote. The overhead lights hummed faintly, casting her in a soft focus, while the chairs around her sat empty. "I want to make something clear." She began, her voice carrying just enough weight to make the people still in the gallery look up from their notes. Today wasn't about a headline. It wasn't about me and the Chief Justice sparring in front of cameras. It was about a simple, stubborn idea that justice in America should not depend on who you know, how much you have, or what circles you move in. Her gaze moved from the gallery to the cameras, locking on to the unseen millions on the other side of the lens. "I've sat in courtrooms where people's entire lives were decided in 5 minutes. I've watched mothers break down because they didn't have the right words or the right lawyer. I've watched veterans be told their service wasn't enough to earn them basic dignity. And I've seen billionaires walk out smiling because they had a friend in the room." The twist came when she leaned closer to the mic, lowering her voice so the audience had to lean in too. "If you've ever been told to just trust the system, ask yourself, has the system ever had to earn your trust, or has it just demanded it?" One of the reporters in the back glanced at the others as if silently agreeing they just found tomorrow's headline. Crockett straightened. "We talk a lot about the separation of powers, but there's another separation that's growing in this country between the people who can knock on the doors of power and the people who can only stand outside hoping someone inside cares enough to open it. My job, and the job of every person in this building, is to close that gap." Her eyes softened, but her tone stayed resolute. "I don't expect the court to change because of one hearing, but I do expect the people watching to remember that those seats, those titles are not sacred. They're borrowed, and they can be reclaimed." She paused, letting the words hang, knowing the silence would carry more weight than any flourish could. If justice really belongs to the people, how long will we let it be managed like private property, and who among us is willing to walk inside and take it back? The echo of Jasmine Crockett's final words still clung to the air when she stepped away from the microphone. Outside room 2141, the marble floors gleamed under the afternoon light, streaming through tall Capitol windows. Each step she took was slow, deliberate, not out of fatigue, but to let the day's gravity settle into her bones. She could feel the weight of 1,000 eyes still on her, even though the cameras were now tucked away in rolling cases. Halfway down the corridor, she passed a TV mounted on the wall. It was playing a replay of her questioning the moment she leaned in and asked Roberts, "If you've ever been told to just trust the system, ask yourself, has the system ever earned your trust?" The closed captions ran across the bottom, and she watched a pair of maintenance workers pause mid-step, eyes fixed on the screen. One of them muttered, "She's right," before the clip cut to commentary. She didn't stop. She didn't need to. The moment had already left the room. It was out in the world now. In her hands, she still held the bundle of letters from constituents, creased envelopes, handwritten notes, smudged ink where someone's thumb had rested too long in thought. They were heavier now, not in weight, but in what they represented. They were the reason she had kept her voice steady when every instinct told her to shout. They were the reason she had pushed past the practiced evasions and the marble-thick walls of tradition. The twist came just before she reached the steps of the Capitol. A woman mid-60s in a faded Union t-shirt was waiting by the rope line. She didn't call out, didn't wave. She just pressed her palm over her heart as Jasmine passed. It was small, wordless, but it was the kind of acknowledgement that told her she'd carried more than her own fight into that room today. She stopped for a moment, turning to take in the view of the mall. The sun was low now, streaking the sky in gold and amber, casting long shadows from the monuments. She thought about every person watching at home, the ones who had been passed over for promotions they'd earned, the ones who had been told policy when what they were facing was prejudice, the ones who had walked into courtrooms and felt invisible before they even spoke. Her chest tightened with the mix of resolve and exhaustion she knew all too well. This fight would not end here, and that was the point. She looked straight into the lens of a photographer snapping her on the steps. Her voice was steady, quiet enough for him to lean in, but strong enough for the words to carry. "If you believe no one is above the law, then you're already part of this fight." She gave a small nod, not to him, but to everyone who would see that image and hear those words later tonight. Then she turned, walking down the steps into the wash of late daylight, each stride a reminder that the distance between the people and their justice could only close if enough voices kept moving toward it. If she can stand in that room and refuse to flinch, what could you do with the truth in your hands? If this story stirred something in you, don't scroll away. Hit like, share it with someone who still believes in truth, and subscribe to TN Insight, where silence becomes strength and every voice matters. Turn on the bell, because the next story, it's already being written, and it might just change the way you see the world. Now tell us what moment in this story stayed with you. Leave your thoughts below. Let's not just watch. Let's remember together. This dramatized story is inspired by real struggles and real people. It's not meant to wound, but to wake us up. Thanks for watching. And remember, truth doesn't end here. It's just waiting for someone to press play.